The bullet should have ended everything. The bomb should have reduced him to ash. The poison should have stopped his heart. But Adolf Hitler, the man responsible for humanity's darkest chapter, survived at least 42 documented assassination attempts, and the true number may never be known. Perhaps the most extraordinary twist in this catalogue of failed murders is this. When British intelligence finally devised a plan with a genuine chance of success, they chose not to pull the trigger. The reason? Hitler was helping them win the war. The early attempts, a pattern of near misses. The violence began almost as soon as Hitler emerged from obscurity. On November 5, 1921, at Munich's legendary Hofbräuhaus beer hall, the future Führer stood at a podium, his voice rising to a crescendo as he harangued a mixed crowd of supporters and opponents. The Nazi Party was barely known, Hitler just another radical agitator in a city teeming with political extremists. Suddenly, chaos erupted. Fists flew, beer steins became weapons. In the mayhem, several shots rang out, aimed directly at the speaker's platform. Hitler continued his rant for another 20 minutes, seemingly oblivious or perhaps emboldened by the attempt on his life. The shooters vanished into the brawling crowd, never to be identified. It was an omen of things to come. Over the next 2 decades, Hitler would develop an almost supernatural reputation for survival. Historians have documented at least 42 distinct plots to end his life, though the chaos of war and the deliberate destruction of Nazi records means the actual number is certainly higher. Some attempts were amateurish, doomed from conception. Others came breathtakingly close to success, missing their mark by minutes or mere meters. Each failure only deepened Hitler's paranoia, while simultaneously reinforcing his growing conviction that he was protected by destiny itself. The Carpenter's Bomb. 13 minutes from history, Georg Elser was not a soldier, a spy, or a political operative. He was a 36-year-old carpenter with steady hands and an unshakable conviction that Adolf Hitler had to die. By November 1939, Germany had already invaded Poland, and Elser believed he could prevent greater bloodshed by eliminating the man at the center of it all. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. Each year on November 8th, Hitler returned to Munich's Bürgerbräukeller to commemorate the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. Elser knew the venue intimately. He'd been scouting it for months. Night after night he worked in secret, hollowing out a pillar directly behind the speaker's podium. His carpentry skills were so precise that guards never noticed the modifications. Inside the pillar he installed a homemade time bomb meticulously constructed from stolen materials. The mechanism was ingenious, the placement perfect. When Hitler took the stage on November 8, 1939, Elser's bomb was ticking away, set to detonate at 9:20 p.m. But fate, or perhaps the accelerating momentum of war, intervened. Hitler had originally planned to stay for his usual 2-hour speech, but worsening weather threatened to ground all flights back to Berlin. The Führer made a last-minute decision: start early, speak quickly, and catch the train instead. He began his remarks at 8:12 p.m. rather than the scheduled 8:30. By 9:07 he had concluded his speech. By 9:12 he had left the building. At 9:20 Elser's bomb detonated exactly as planned. The explosion tore through the pillar, bringing tons of ceiling crashing down on the speaker's podium. 8 people died in the blast. Dozens more were maimed and injured. But Adolf Hitler was already miles away, sitting safely on a train. Elser was captured that same night trying to cross the Swiss border, bomb-making materials still in his possession. The Gestapo tortured him extensively, convinced he must be part of a larger conspiracy. They couldn't accept that one man, a carpenter with no military training, no political connections, no wealthy backers, had come within 13 minutes of changing the course of history. Elser spent the next 6 years in concentration camps. In April 1945, with the Third Reich collapsing around them, the SS dragged him from his cell and executed him. He died just weeks before Allied forces would have liberated the camp. The conspirators within, when the army turned as Hitler's war machine rolled across Europe. The attempts on his life became increasingly sophisticated and increasingly desperate. Many now came from within his own military establishment, from decorated officers who had once saluted him and now plotted his death. In March 1943, Major General Henning von Tresckow orchestrated one of the most audacious attempts. When Hitler flew to Smolensk to inspect Army Group Center, Treskov convinced one of the Führer's aides to carry a gift back to headquarters, 2 bottles of Cointreau, or so he claimed. In reality, the package contained British plastic explosives molded to resemble bottles, fitted with a 30-minute chemical fuse. As Hitler's plane took off, the timer began counting down. Treskov and his co-conspirator, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, waited for the radio confirmation that would never come. 2 hours later, Hitler's plane landed safely in East Prussia. The bomb had failed to detonate. The aircraft's unheated cargo hold had frozen the detonator. In a scene of almost unbearable tension, Schlabrendorf flew to retrieve the package before anyone discovered it, using the excuse of exchanging it for actual Cointreau. He disarmed the bomb with trembling hands, finding the detonator had worked perfectly, but the main charge had failed to ignite. Just a week later, Treskow's network tried again. Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. During an exhibition of captured Soviet weapons that Hitler was scheduled to attend, Gersdorf would wear a coat packed with explosives. He would stay close to the Führer and detonate himself at the optimal moment. Gersdorf activated the 10-minute fuse and positioned himself to guide Hitler through the exhibit. But the Führer, perhaps sensing danger or simply bored, rushed through the display in less than 3 minutes and slipped out a side door. Gersdorf frantically excused himself and defused the bomb in a bathroom with just seconds to spare. Operation Valkyrie, the most famous failure. By July 1944, the conspiracy against Hitler had metastasized into a full-blown resistance movement within the Wehrmacht. The plotters had grown beyond a handful of disillusioned officers to include dozens of high-ranking officials, diplomats, and aristocrats. They called their plan Operation Valkyrie, a scheme not just to assassinate Hitler, but to immediately seize control of the government and sue for peace. With the Western allies, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg became the plot's unlikely hero, a war veteran who had lost his left eye, right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand in combat. Stauffenberg had been promoted to a position that gave him regular access to Hitler's military briefings. He alone could get close enough to deliver the killing blow. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg arrived at Hitler's Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia, carrying a leather briefcase packed with British-made plastic explosives. The bomb was armed and ticking as Stauffenberg entered the conference room, placing it under the heavy oak table as close to Hitler as possible. Making an excuse about a phone call, Stauffenberg left the room. Minutes later, the explosion ripped through the conference building. The blast was enormous. Wood splintered, papers flew, bodies were hurled across the room. 4 men died. Everyone else was wounded. Stauffenberg, watching from a distance, was certain Hitler could not have survived, but he had. An officer named Heinz Brandt, perhaps shifting position or reaching for a document, had inadvertently moved Stauffenberg's briefcase behind one of the table's thick wooden legs. That leg, along with the table's massive construction, had shielded Hitler from the worst of the blast. The Führer emerged with singed trousers, a perforated eardrum and conjunctivitis, but alive. Hitler's revenge was swift and merciless. Stauffenberg was executed by firing squad that very night. Over the following months, more than 4,000 people were arrested in connection with the plot. Hundreds were executed, many after show trials before the notorious judge Roland Freisler. Some were slowly strangled with piano wire, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing pleasure. The resistance within the German military was effectively decapitated. After surviving the July 20th plot, Hitler declared himself invincible and immortal, protected by divine providence. He commissioned a special wound badge to commemorate the event. His paranoia, already extreme, became pathological. Yet the assassination attempts continued, right up until the final days of the war. Operation Foxley, the shot that was never fired in the summer of 1944. As Allied forces surged across France following the D-Day landings, Britain's Special Operations Executive was developing its most carefully crafted assassination plot yet. Codenamed Operation Foxley, it represented the culmination of years of intelligence gathering and operational planning. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a captured German soldier who had served as one of Hitler's personal guards at the Berghof, the Führer's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps near Berchtesgaden. During interrogation, he revealed a critical vulnerability in Hitler's security routine. Every morning around 10 a.m., Hitler took a solitary 20-minute walk from the main house to the tea house, a small tea house on Muslanakopf Hill. The dictator insisted on walking alone, leaving him unprotected as he passed through a wooded area out of sight of guard posts. A Nazi flag flew from the Berghof whenever Hitler was in residence, visible from a cafe in the town below. A perfect signal for any watchers. The SOE planners worked with meticulous detail. They would parachute a two-man team into Austria, a German-speaking Pole and a highly trained British sniper. An inside man had already been recruited, an anti-Nazi shopkeeper in Salzburg, who would shelter the assassins and transport them to Berchtesgaden disguised. As German mountain troops, the sniper would use a German Mauser Kar 98K rifle fitted with a telescopic sight, making it indistinguishable from Wehrmacht-issue weapons. The weapon would be equipped with a specially designed silencer. The shooter practiced extensively on moving targets under conditions that simulated the planned attack. If the primary sniper failed, a backup team with a Piat anti-tank weapon would be positioned to ambush Hitler's car as he fled. By all accounts, Operation Foxley had a genuine chance of success. The intelligence was solid. The plan was workable. Winston Churchill himself had given his approval for the mission to proceed. Everything was ready, and then, in one of history's most calculated decisions, the British government decided not to pull the trigger. The strategic paradox, Hitler as Allied asset. The debate within British intelligence was intense and, in retrospect, reveals a cold calculation that would have been unthinkable in the early days of the war. The deputy head of the SOE's German directorate, Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Thornley, led the opposition to Operation Foxley with arguments that, while pragmatic, were deeply cynical. Thornley's first concern was myth-making. If Hitler died at the hands of Allied assassins, he argued, the Führer would become a martyr. Worse, it would allow Germans to claim they had been on the verge of victory when Hitler was killed, that the war had been stabbed in the back by assassination. It was exactly the kind of narrative that had poisoned German politics after World War I and helped bring Hitler to power in the first place. The Allies needed Germany to suffer an undeniable total defeat. Hitler had to fail visibly and completely, but Thornley's second argument was even more remarkable. Hitler was actively helping the Allied cause by being alive. By 1944, Hitler's strategic incompetence had become obvious to Allied intelligence. The Führer had seized absolute control over German military operations, overruling his generals and making catastrophic decisions based on ideology, intuition, and increasingly delusional thinking. He refused to allow tactical retreats, leading to the encirclement and destruction of entire German armies. He diverted resources to vanity projects and held grudges that compromised military effectiveness. He made Germany fight a two-front war when any competent strategist would have sought to consolidate positions. A secret memo from a British intelligence officer, identified only as Agent X, laid out the calculus bluntly. As a strategist, Hitler has been of the greatest possible assistance to the British war effort. If Hitler died, there was a real possibility he might be replaced by someone competent, someone who would listen to experienced generals, who would make rational decisions about resource allocation, who might even seek a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to regroup and rearm. The nightmare scenario was a capable successor who could extend the war by months or years. The Allied leadership faced a darkly ironic truth. The best thing they could do to shorten the war and minimize casualties was to ensure that Adolf Hitler remained in command of Nazi Germany. The decision in November 1944, the formal proposal for Operation Foxley, was submitted up the chain of command. By this point, Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts. The Red Army was approaching Germany from the east. American and British forces were pushing through France toward the Rhine. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. German cities were burning under round-the-clock bombing. Churchill, who had initially supported the assassination plan, listened to his advisers. The debate continued through the winter. Some argued for proceeding. Ending Hitler's life would still have symbolic value and might shorten the war by weeks, saving thousands of lives. Others held firm that Hitler alive was more valuable than Hitler dead. In the end, pragmatism won. In March 1945, just 5 weeks before Hitler's suicide, the SOE formally cancelled Operation Foxley. The carefully trained sniper would never be deployed. The silenced Luger pistol prepared for the mission, now displayed in a British military museum, would never be fired at its intended target. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet artillery pounding Berlin and enemy soldiers literally blocks away, Adolf Hitler finally achieved what 42 separate assassination plots had failed to accomplish. He put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. The impossible question. In the decades since, historians have endlessly debated whether Operation Foxley should have gone forward. Would killing Hitler in 1944 have shortened the war? Would it have prevented the final months of slaughter as Germany collapsed? Would it have saved the lives of Holocaust victims still being murdered, even as the Reich crumbled? Or would a dead Hitler have become a powerful myth, a martyr around whom Germans could rally? Would a more competent successor have stabilized German defenses and prolonged the conflict? Would it have led to negotiations and a soft peace that left Nazi ideology intact, ready to resurface decades later? We can never know. What we do know is that Hitler's survival through 42 assassination attempts, a combination of luck, paranoia, and enemy miscalculation, represents one of history's darkest ironies. The man who caused more death and suffering than perhaps any other in human history was, by the war's end, so ineffective and self-destructive that his enemies chose to keep him alive. The untold story of Operation Foxley reveals something profound about the nature of warfare and leadership. That sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one you can kill, but the one whose continued existence serves your purposes. Hitler spent the final years of his life convinced he was invincible, protected by fate to complete his mission. In truth, he had become the Allies' unwitting asset, his delusions and incompetence hastening the very destruction he feared most. The carpenter from Munich came within 13 minutes. The colonel with the briefcase came within a table leg's width. The British sniper never took his shot. In the end, the only person who could kill Adolf Hitler was Adolf Hitler himself, and by the time he did, he had already lost everything he sought to build.